Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you for joining this event dedicated to gender in the curriculum. I am Francesco Lucioli, and I am the EDI officer of the UCD School of Languages, Cultures and Linguistics. And I welcome you also on behalf of the other organizers of this workshop, that is Professor Bettina Migge and Ms. Melanie Pape, chair and co-chair of the Athena Swan self-assessment team. Last year, our school was awarded an Athena Swan Bronze Medal. As part of our application, we decided to organize this workshop, which aims to facilitate a multidisciplinary discussion about gender and explore how to enhance knowledge about diversity and gender in the university curriculum. I would like to thank the speakers who will talk to us today and explore, among others, the current notions and theories of gender and ways of embedding them in university research practices, in teaching activities, and model descriptors. I remind you that each speaker will give a 10-minute presentation followed by 5-minute questions. I will interrupt, I'm sorry, I will interrupt the speakers when 10 minutes are over, just to allow time for questions. If you want to ask questions, please write them in the chat and we will then address them. I also remind you that there will be more time for questions and discussion at the end of the workshop. Also because there is a little change in the program. Unfortunately, Dr. Mary McAuliffe, who was the last of our speakers, cannot be with us today. So we will use her slot for a final Q&A session. I kindly ask those who are not going to talk to mute the microphones to avoid noise. And I also remind you that this workshop is recorded and will be made available on the school EDI website. Okay, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker. That is Dr. Ursula Fanning, Associate Professor in Italian at the UCD School of Languages, Cultures and Linguistics. And she's going to talk about doing gender, casting the net wide. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen with you because I have a PowerPoint presentation, or rather I'm going to try to share my screen with you. We'll see what happens. So, okay, sorry. Okay, so, this is not meant to happen. Okay, right. So you've had a quick preview of all of the slides nearly there, starting with the end one, which is great. So now you know exactly what I'm going to say. I'm going to stop talking. Okay, I'd like to start off really by saying thank you very much to Bettina, our head of school, and to Francesco, our EDI officer in SLCL, for the invitation to participate in what should be, I hope, a really interesting session today. And thanks also to Melanie for a fantastic behind the scenes organization and prodding us all in the right direction at the right time. I'd like to preface my remarks by noting that what I'm going to say is very much based on my personal experience of teaching and research, although there might be some overlap, obviously, with what people are going to say later on, and perhaps particularly people who are talking about literature, because that's predominantly what I'm going to be talking about myself. So this is really no more than a very brief mapping out of what's very much an ongoing journey for me in terms of teaching and research. And I hadn't had time to think specifically or to discuss specifically the module descriptor. That's something that I'd be happy to talk about afterwards if people want to come back to that. But it's very much a brief mapping out of what's really an ongoing journey for me. And I am grateful really for that ongoingness, because it necessitates changes in approach as one goes on with one's teaching and research. And it's very much, I think, a reflection of some really vibrant theoretical debate in the areas of equality, diversity and inclusion, of which gender is one aspect, albeit a crucial one, and certainly as far as I'm concerned, a crucial one. So I want to start with an unintentionally arresting and potentially provocative image that several of you may have seen in your visits to the Newman building in UCD in what now seems like another existence. During the refurbishment work in our school, this little gem made its appearance at one point. I love it because it's an excellent, albeit entirely unintentional, visual example of debates around gender and sexuality in terms of identity and identification, naming and orientation. And both word and image are very important here, obviously. So you end up asking yourself, what is the facility in question and for whom is it intended? It's not named as such, and its potential addressees are multiple, but only inadvertently so. Without intending to, it represents questions of gender difference, and it hints at both inclusion and exclusion, terms that are central really to debate around gender in society and in the curriculum at present. And I'll come back to those debates towards the end of this mini exposition. My own interest in gender has firm roots in feminism and in feminist theory, in part because of the period in which I began my research and teaching, which I like to refer to as the dark ages of the 1980s, and in part because of what remains the relative marginality of women's voices in Italian literature of the 19th and 20th centuries, which is my primary research area still. Interestingly, I spoke in 2019 at a workshop for early career researchers on Italian studies theory and practice, precisely in a session on gender, authorship and reception. And that was in 2019 at UCC, so only a couple of years ago. It feels like a century ago, but it was just a couple of years ago. But what surprised me in that panel, really, when the program was finalized, was that each of the papers that were offered by the early career researcher contributors in the gender panel specifically focused on women writers. So there wasn't anything about trans writers, there wasn't anything about queer writing, there was nothing about that. It's all about women writers in particular. And I think this slide of Lala Romano, who's a writer whose work spanned to the 20th century, pretty much encapsulates why this is so, and also gives an indication of a situation that still obtained at least until the end of the 20th century, and I would argue certainly beyond that. So Romano says here, essere donna poi nell'ambiente letterario del nostro paese pesa ancora molto, ti trattano con una sorta di condiscenza. So to be a woman in the literary environment of our country is still a heavy thing, it's still a weighty thing, it still weighs a lot, if you like. They treat you with a kind of condescension. Romano was a very prolific writer who died 20 years ago this year, and her own work fell foul of a typical underestimation and misreading of women's writing in the Italian context. And much of my own early research work was part of that, what is now a very well-established process of unearthing women writers and bringing their work into the light. But I was never interested in their work only because they were women writers. I was always interested in how they represented individuals as subjects and objects of narrative in their writings, in how they represented their society and its norms, and also specifically in how they defined gender. So they very often contest and also sometimes reinforce stereotypical notions of gender in their own time. And when I started teaching in UCD, I very much wanted to integrate my teaching with my research, obviously, and to bring something new to the table in terms of the Italian curriculum at UCD at that stage. And so I introduced a course on Italian women writers, and that's the one I want to talk a little bit about today. And that course on Italian women writers focused on works written at what you might call pinch points throughout the 20th century. So from the start of the century with its very restrictive family law to long overdue changes in the 1970s through to the close of the century. And I haven't stopped teaching that course, even though it focuses specifically on women writers, because for me, it's still relevant. And it's a course that has appealed to a wide range of students and not just female students. And one of my aims in the course has always been that as a group, we would interrogate notions of and stereotypes around gender in our own time, as well as in the time of the writers that we were looking at, and that we would compare these with the constructions of gender that are offered in the texts that we're looking at. So part of that process also involves looking at stereotypical representations of gender in our contemporary culture, both in Italy and beyond, including representations presented in advertising media, for instance, contemporary advertising media. And it's really easy, of course, still to find depressingly stereotypical representations of women in advertising, but it's also fascinating to see how advertisers seem to have been attempting what they conceive of as a kind of equal opportunities policy, which turns out to be often an equal opportunities policy of objectification. So we have female characters and female figures and male figures in really stereotypical, really objectified poses, and often very sexualized for men as well as for women. And what I'm thinking of here in particular is the Hollister ads from a couple of years ago that showed various sort of parts of male and female bodies, so intensely objectified, with a real process of depersonalization involved, and that was across the board really effectively. So put simply, this particular module, although it focuses on women writers, it doesn't mean that it presents just one side of what is a many-sided story, because as Terrell Carver put it in his 1996 monograph, gender is not a synonym for women. So it's about much more than that, obviously. And I want to acknowledge that in debates on gender at the moment, there are undoubtedly real contemporary flashpoints between feminism and feminist theory, queer theory, and transgender theory. And they have their roots in distinctions between sex and gender. And I think those flashpoints may be particularly acute in the Italian context, where difference theory is at the heart of many not so distant iterations of Italian feminism. There's a kind of ongoing jostling for theoretical edge between different groups, really effectively. And I suppose for me, I kind of hold fast to the same thing all the time, in a way, looking at things in different ways, but with the same starting point, which is that I always argue for a kind of a situated critical approach and according primacy to the different kinds of texts with which we work, while constantly using new and different lenses to interrogate those texts. So I really believe it's crucial to be attentive to the texts themselves, to the texts that we're working on, in relation to what they say, in relation to how they say it, and to their contexts. And we need to allow the texts to speak for themselves, even while we're also situating ourselves at a particular point, readjusting our vision periodically to take into account as much as possible other perspectives that often offer very different possibilities of reading and interpretation. And it seems to me that an intersectional approach, I'm borrowing the idea here really, as Patricia Hill Collins and Surma Bilge put it in their 2016 volume on intersectionality, an intersectional approach provides a framework for explaining how divisions of race, gender, age, and citizenship status, amongst others, position people differently in the world. And that positioning idea seems to be really crucial to me. And for me, it's linked to a notion of a kind of strategic essentialism, that is, rejecting essentialism per se and noting its limitations, but also maintaining a hopefully workable notion of women as one collective, defined by systemic social practices, as well as by practices of opposition. So the texts which we read and with which we engage position themselves in particular spaces, and we need to take cognizance first of their position, I think. In other words, we should be clear about where we're standing, where we're starting from, and also where the chosen texts are standing and starting from. But we also need to be ready to move in different directions. Intersectionality is a relational practice, and the relations and interactions of different contemporary theories to each other can be highly productive. So I think some of the questions posed by Edward Said, post-Orientalism, in his essay, Opponents, Audiences, Constituencies and Community, still have relevance for the investigation of contested aspects of contemporary theories, starting with the question, who writes? Which is so intimately linked now to these ever-shifting concepts of identity. And the issue of critical inquiry for which Said was writing was devoted to, appropriately enough, the politics of interpretation. Said followed up that opening question, who writes, immediately with the further questions, for whom is the writing being done? And in what circumstances? So I think all of these questions are really hugely valid for us, precisely in drawing our attention to positionality, the positionality of the writer, the positionality of the reader, and the context of the work that is being done, as well as the context of interpretation. And they're at the core really of what I keep coming back to in terms of both research on and negotiating and constructing curricula in relation to questions of gender. Now, there's a whole other debate that can be had about the teaching of language, obviously, and the genderedness of languages as well. And I think that's also something that's very interesting, but it's something I haven't really had time to go into today. So I'm focused particularly on literature for that reason. But those are my thoughts in kind of a nascent form, I suppose. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ursula. Thank you. It was a really fascinating insight and introduction also to our workshop. I would open discussion. I don't know if there are questions on the chat, or if you want to add questions or ask questions, you can simply unmute your microphone to ask Ursula. I see a lot of clapping hands for Sabine. Ah, okay.
Just out of interest, Ursula, I just wanted to ask, when you which you're still doing, teaching your course on women writers, and as far as I know, you're interested in 19th century and not just 20th century, right? Is it difficult to find accessible texts by women writers? Because I know that, you know, in German, when you try to teach literature from the 19th and 18th century, and you really try desperately to include some texts by female writers, it's usually, it's not that easy to find texts that would then be easily accessible to students, either by having them in editions that you can kind of just tell them to buy, or elsewhere. So that's very often a real problem there when it comes to the teaching context. I don't know how that is in Italian.
You mean literally in terms of accessibility, in terms of literally getting hold of those texts? Yeah, actually, surprisingly, not, because I think probably because of the fact that this course in particular is on 20th century writers. If I were dealing with 19th century writers, it then becomes another story. So for instance, there's a 19th century woman writer that I include in my short stories course. And while the inverted commas, the canonical, the big writers in the 19th century in the Italian context are very, very accessible, and their work keeps being reprinted. This is not necessarily the case with women writers, obviously, of the 19th century. So I find in that case, I'm scanning stuff and putting it up on Brightspace for students so that they can access it. In the 20th century, interestingly enough, not so much, because there are various feminist publishing houses that have been, again, reclaiming women writers' work. So certainly, you know, there is, I haven't found problems in that respect. So that's been good. Yeah. Thanks, Sabina.
Devon? Yes, please.
Sorry, just on that, because I think that is an interesting point, and I'm reminded also, Ursula, what you're saying about the particular Italian context. There's an interesting example of, I suppose, of how central women writers and gender is to in the early modern French, and one of these is this 6-volume theatre. So theatre by theatre of all things, which was the domain of the whatever about the novel which women were supposed to write, but the theatre which required rhetoric and whatever. And the 6 volumes of early modern theatre recently produced, which brings about whatever 40 female dramatists to light, and this was this princely sum of €10. So it's interesting, and yet what's also interesting is that there's kind of about 2 women behind it who have just been hugely influential. So it's interesting how, you know, a couple of individuals can, you know, change a whole accessibility literally, and obviously the language is something different, 16th century French, but yeah, I think it's important actually when they're suddenly available in modern editions. You know what I mean? It facilitates things. Just a minor point, just in terms of context.
Yeah, no, it's great. Absolutely, it's lovely to see that kind of thing happening. And I mean, there was, I think, I'm trying to think now, the 1990s, 1980s, 1990s. There was a very influential feminist publishing house in the Italian context like that, Uga. But that's actually, so again, some of these publishing houses come and go. You know, they survive for maybe 10 years and then they go out of existence. But then, you know, something else will come back and take its place. Another publishing house steps up, if you like. So there has been, but it's interesting that that kind of unearthing is still going on. You would think we had moved past that point, but it's absolutely not the case. Yeah. So.
And I think just to come back, I think your point about positionality is brilliant. I think that's really, really important. The fact that you're not, it's as much about us, obviously, as it is about the position of the reader.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's really crucial. And you see it with the students as well. Obviously, when students are engaging with the text, that they're kind of identifying their own positions as well. And it's just fascinating to see that kind of interaction between texts that are sometimes, particularly the ones from the turn of the century, I guess, from the turn of the 20th century, where you would think that maybe there might be certain things there that would seem passé or that wouldn't speak to students, you know, but that in fact actually do, you know, because again, they're identifying the positionality of the writer and their own positionality. And it's just really interesting to see that kind of interchange going on.
We have a comment here as well, just if we want to take the comment as well. It's yeah, that the positionality of the writer intrigues me, particularly for intersectionality, read gender, disability. For example, the voice of a dyslexic woman is unlikely to be heard in doctoral level writing.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Actually, you're absolutely right. I mean, I can't think of any examples of that. Any voices of dyslexic women, for instance. disability, I mean, there are different cases in relation to disability, and actually it's a very interesting example. It's a contemporary writer called Clara Amy, who is not herself a disabled writer, but she has a disabled son, and she's talking about negotiating his position a lot of the time, and negotiating, you know, on his behalf, and not only on his behalf, she also gives him a voice in the course of her narrative and draws on what he actually has to say. And it's not a text that I teach, but it's a really interesting text from that point of view. And it is a text actually on which a good deal of research has been done. But you're right, I mean, the dyslexic voice is one that, you know, I haven't heard effectively. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ursula. And now we can move to our second speaker.
Yeah, so as our next speaker, we have Dr. Eavan O'Brien, and she's currently working for the Technological Higher Education Association, and she will be talking about the interactions of gender in teaching and the research of literature.
Lovely. Thank you, Francesco. Thank you, Melanie. And I loved Ursula's presentation just there, because I think this will build on and complement and maybe even reiterate some of the points you just made. So thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. So in my presentation, which I'll keep quite brief, I'll pose a couple of reflective questions, and I'll give my own thoughts in reaction to those questions, based on my own past teaching and research experience, and also some of my more recent work as well. So my thoughts will focus on the early modern period, particularly in relation to Spain, but I hope and think my thoughts will also be quite relevant to more recent periods and also to other cultural contexts. So some of you might have met me before, and I've had a couple of different career lives, so to speak. So in a past life, I taught and researched in TCD. I don't currently work as a lecturer, so I'll be really interested in the views of the other participants at this webinar. As was mentioned, I'm currently working with the Technological Higher Education Association on the Promoting Consent and Preventing Sexual Violence project. And in doing that, I'm actually on secondment from my previous job, which was as Assistant Director at the Irish Research Council. So I'm coming at this with a couple of different hats. So my first question is, how do we define gender? And I guess as just before asking that question, I'll comment that I do think that good teaching and excellent research, they need to be gender sensitive. But how do we define gender? So I've included here two definitions, one for sex, one for gender, which were proposed by a Horizon 2020 expert group. They're quite wordy, so and you might have nicer definitions of your own, but they essentially draw that distinguishing feature that we're also familiar with already, that sex is basically the biological and gender is more sociocultural. The definition of gender, I think, is quite nice here because it points out some aspects of gender that may be relevant to your teaching and research, these being gender norms, gender identities, and gender relations. And those will be points that I'll touch on a little later in this short presentation. So my next question is whether literature can inform students about gender. And I would answer that very much in the affirmative with a resounding yes. That literature can highlight gender norms and gender relations, both past and present. So this slide includes a quotation, which I've translated, but it is widely available in translations as well, published form, by a writer called Maria de Zayas, or Zayas, one might pronounce it. She was a 17th century Spanish author and quite celebrated in her day. She was born in Madrid. And in this quote, which actually does echo a quote, much more modern quotes that Ursula included in her presentation, she mocks disparaging attitudes towards women's intellect and attitudes towards women's publishing or putting their writing out there for the public to digest. And I think this and so many other quotations from literature show that gender norms are constantly changing, they're constantly in flux. And this is shown in one way by the changing reception of literary texts. So analyzing literature can tell us something about the world in which it was written, but it can also tell us something about the world in which we now live. And I'm sure as you will do in your teaching, I think it's really interesting to encourage active responses from students to texts, because we can learn from them as well in terms of their responses to what they're reading. So a question that I ask here is, what literature is currently being taught, particularly on the undergraduate curriculum? So on this slide, I include a series of very well-known Spanish 16th and 17th century authors who tend to feature on the undergraduate teaching curriculum. They did in my day, certainly, and they probably still do. And you'll notice a common feature amongst them that I won't need to point out. But I'm sure no matter what disciplinary background you're from, you'll recognize some of them. Miguel de Cervantes, of course, the author of Don Quixote. Others here are Lope de Vega, Pedro Calderón de la Barca, Francisco de Quevedo, Luis de Góngora, and Baltasar Gracián. So, of course, the vast majority of authors in Spain and in other countries in the early modern period were male, but there were also celebrated female authors such as Maria de Zayas, who was on the previous slide there. And I think in teaching, we need to be careful not to perpetuate gender inequality by overlooking this fact. So we all have a tricky job, I guess, in putting together our reading lists for undergraduate curriculum. And one variable to include in putting together the reading list is gender and other variables in deciding which authors make the final cut. So ultimately, I would suggest that the curriculum should be diverse. It should be thought-provoking. I include another quote here, which is kind of out of context, but I included it just because I love it so much, and it often makes me think. So this quote came from Arunjati Roy's 2004 Sydney Peace Prize lecture. And I think it's relevant to teaching, but it's relevant to so much else that we do. We must always ask ourselves, which voices are unheard, which voices are silenced, and what can we do to address that? So I have done a little on this slide to try and address the imbalance of the 1-2 slides previous. So I include here some female authors and even a trans male author from the same era around the world. So these are not just Spain, they're from a variety of countries. Marguerite de Navarre, Louise Labé, Margaret Cavendish, Madame de Sévigné, Anne Finch, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, and Antonio de Arauso, who was born Catalina de Arauso. And a question might be, how would we teach their writing? How might their writing be studied? So in most cases, in undergraduate teaching courses, these will be included amongst male-authored writing, and that's perfectly acceptable, that's great. And no matter what the texts are, whether they're male or female authored, I would suggest that what's worth considering are harking back to those gender norms, gender identities, and gender relations. So they're always worth considering no matter who has written the text. But I do see a value in addressing gaps by actually putting together special modules that address any underrepresented groups that are related to those underrepresented groups. And it's interesting to see what common themes or common symbolism emerges by doing so. And it can be also worth looking at the differences, of course, not assuming that groups are homogenous either. So it reminds me of, say, an undergraduate course I taught. It was to fourth-year students in TCD, which was primarily focused on women writers of the Spanish-speaking world. Or there was a master's module I taught on many years ago, which was in comparative literature, and it included women of the early modern period of France, England, and Spain, and looked at some commonalities and differences between them, and that was entitled Culture and Confinement at the time. So there are lots of different ways of doing this, and I'm sure many here are already doing that. And then, because I suppose it's on my mind given my current role, I ask myself the question of, can literature teach us about sexual violence and sexual consent? And I would answer that as a yes as well. Approaching texts that contain sexual violence can be both challenging and rewarding. There's no doubt about that. And this goes for texts of the past and of the present. But when this is done sensitively, I think it can enable important thinking to take place among us as staff, but also among students. Potentially important discussions can happen. And at the very least, what I would suggest would be if you find yourself teaching a text, for example, that does include sexual violence, I would suggest that you encourage students to take whatever consent training or bystander intervention course that's offered by the university. It's a nice segue into recommending such courses be taken. And I saw just recently, of course, that the UCD Students' Union passed a motion that such training would be made mandatory, but I think reiterating it and stating its value positively is always very, very welcome. It's also important to note that even when we may least suspect it, a text that contains some element of sexual violence can be triggering or emotionally quite difficult for some students based on their own past experiences. So I would recommend warning students in advance that a text will contain material of this kind. So you're basically preparing them for this. That can be very helpful. And also, as lecturers, having at your fingertips details about support services in case somebody approaches you with questions. So those support services would be both internal to the institution and external as well. So it's a good thing to have, I think, in general as a member of staff. And then jumping to a slightly different area in this regard, should we integrate gender analysis into research, since we've been talking mostly about teaching so far? And again, that's a yes. Including sex, gender, and intersectional analysis adds valuable dimensions to your research. And you're probably aware that the European Commission, being one of the largest funders of research in the world, has said that sex and gender analysis would be mandatory under its Horizon Europe programme. And this will apply to all disciplines, except for ones that they've signaled where this mightn't be relevant. So that would just include the likes of pure mathematics, for example. So it's generally considered that social sciences and humanities, that sex gender analysis is very relevant to those areas. This is also a requirement of many national funders, as you're probably aware, such as the Irish Research Council. So actually even introducing sex and gender analysis as part of your teaching, I think it's useful for staff because it gets them thinking, but it's also useful for the students because it's part of their training should they later on go into research. It's already getting them thinking along those lines. So just to say thank you very much for listening, and there are resources available to help staff and students in terms of analysing gender in research, for instance, so happy to share those, or if anyone has any questions, very, very happy to take them. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Eavan. It was really, really interesting and I think also very thought-provoking because, for example, I was thinking about the way of balancing the presence of male and female authors in a curriculum, particularly when we focus on, as you did, and working on medieval and Renaissance literature. It's not so easy because we know that there are female authors, women writers, but it's not very easy to introduce them in a curriculum that is a very traditional one. So if I teach Dante, it's very difficult to introduce contemporary women writers, but it could be possible, and it's possible. In this case, the topic of the translation of the original text becomes very important because the need of having texts by female authors translated in English is very, very important from the point of view of the teaching. So thanks again for this, your talk.
It's a pleasure. I think, as you say, I think having the availability of good editions, the availability of translations, should you wish to teach something that's comparative, is key. Thankfully, I think starting in the United States, there was kind of a rediscovery of a lot of these authors in Spanish. So that means that there are copies available of these books in both Spanish, more published in Spain, but in English, largely published in America. So that is helpful. But it's interesting in charting the reception because you can see that there was, at least in Spain, a lot of these authors, they were popular at the time, but there was a gap. There was a period, probably Victorian type period, where they were forgotten or denigrated in some way. So we almost have to revive them, resurrect them. but they're there, and I imagine they're there in pretty much every European culture. Just you might have to look quite hard to find them.
I just wanted to say,
yes,
it reminds me very much when I was a student a long time ago. One of the things that was brought in, for example, was on the one hand, there was the traditional English, whatever, canon, but then suddenly one person started with whatever black literature, that's what they called them at the time. And everybody really liked that. And so everybody went for these classes. But then there was always this idea about the canon. And in a sense, both of you have been talking about, okay, what is the literary canon, for example? And what both of you, Ursula and you, suggest is that the canon is very biased and it needs to be seriously investigated. So one way in which they tried to bring these two things together for us, for example, was to look at, for example, how whatever Shakespeare or whoever was reinterpreted, say, in the Caribbean or in Asia. And that actually was very interesting because it brought together this whole discussion about what is the canon, why is it the canon, and what are people making of it when they are reimagining it, and what new thoughts come into it. So yeah, it's more like a comment, but my question would be, so do you think that basically this reassessment of what is a literary, or like even if we take it outside of the literature into whatever the canon of agriculture or the canon of social sciences or whatever, that is really what we need to look at? It's like, what other things are there, and who has talked about it and who has never been seen?
I think that is key, absolutely. And I remember things may have changed since then, but I remember certainly as a postgraduate student in some conferences, for example, giving my talk about Ana Caro or Maria de Zayas, you could tell there were a few sort of switching off because they weren't Góngora or Quevedo, they weren't the big Pale Male Stale canon members. So yeah, I think there is a process of reassessment that needs to be done and throw out the canon and not quite start again, but at least scrutinize it carefully, and what voices are silenced, what voices are unheard, and even look back and see, well, were they heard previously, and what happened that they were suddenly silenced in the period that has elapsed since then. So yeah, questioning is always wise, I think. And I think it's interesting as well seeing how interested students often are when you throw an unexpected text or author into the mix, because certainly I back in my time I did detect a lot of interest there, and there was a bit of zoning out, I think, often when the more established authors were presented to them, but when something a bit more unexpected came along, that you could see light bulb moments going on.
Yeah, I totally agree with you.
Yeah, Ursula? And then
Thanks very much. Yeah, it was a great paper. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Eavan. Yeah, I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about the canon and issues of canonicity. And there's always going to be a debate about whether you should hive off, your writers, hive off, say, women writers, for example, and say, look at them separately. And I think there's still an argument for doing that, most definitely. But it's also good to bring them in to other courses, let's say, and not hive them up, but to have them as representatives, I don't know, of realism or of science fiction writing, whatever it might be that you're looking at. But what's also really interesting, I think, in terms of canonical texts, which we all have to teach at some point or another, is to kind of interrogate how gender is represented in those texts as well. I'm sure everybody's doing this already, but I think that can be really interesting, so that, if you like, even the canonical writers can have things to say on this, and they're not always the things that you might expect them to have to say. They can often be quite subversive, maybe in their own ways, and in ways that we haven't thought about. I think Manzoni is a really good example of that as well. Boccaccio, with the whole kind of transgender cross-dressing, sort of it's fascinating. So there's a lot that you can do with that as well. Thank you.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah, absolutely. And it's probably more realistic because of there's only so many modules anyone can offer. It's often more realistic to incorporate, say, a text that's written by a woman into a module that may be dominated by male text. But either way, as you say, including gender norms, gender relations as variables for analysis, I think is very rewarding. And as you say, I have been torn myself about the value of the separate module, because there's always the danger of kind of ghettoizing the women, or trans matters, or disability, or whatever the matter is. But I come down on the balance that I think such modules can be really very exciting, but I can see the other argument too, of course.
Yeah, if I could come in there, actually, I think exactly a point Eavan just made in relation to Ursula as well. The idea of the number of modules, I mean, it's a very practical concern, but I have found, I used to teach a course on equality, and because it was Feminism and Equality written by men, the three big egalitarian treatises in early modern Europe, as Francesco came from France, equality as opposed to Querelle des Femmes. And I used to get essays then that would say, Poulain de la Barre, whatever, was this very famous, main writer. And I'm thinking, no, he wasn't. And it was because there hadn't been enough, and again, even in second year, because there isn't sometimes time to go through all those. I mean, yes, I'm the first person to want to deconstruct the canon as well, but you have to include, at some point, there has to be some awareness of who Molière and Racine were, at least. And without that, I found that, just practically speaking, that there was an imbalance. It was very difficult to try and remind. I suppose there was no basics. Do you know what I mean? Or frequently it was difficult to kind of get I don't mean the canonical basis, but just some sense of some awareness. Or you'd have, Molière and, I don't know, Villejuif been treated on the same level. And I'm not talking about their literary ability. There would be many to argue that they are, but just even in terms of reception. So I found it difficult sometimes to build on a very fragmented basis, to have any sense of do you know what I mean? You can only introduce how something is new if there's an awareness of what was old. You know what I mean? Well, that's
completely.
But you know what I mean? It was kind of on shifting sands, and you were trying to build something on something that wasn't there. So.
No, I completely see that there's a tension there, I think, naturally, in terms of, you need to have the foundations in order to understand what's special. So yeah, and there are limits on time, limits on so many practical aspects in terms of how much you can introduce. So yeah, that's an ongoing battle, no doubt.
Pascal, do you have a question? No, your microphone, Pascal. Sorry.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Eavan, for the paper. I really enjoyed it, and especially lovely to see the early modern Hispanic women writers up there. And just to really go back on what's been said before, that I find as well, sometimes if you've got a course, and for instance, I'm doing one on cross-cultural encounters, where we're looking at Columbus and de las Casas, who are kind of established figures, and we need to look at them. But then when we introduce Sor Juana, you really do see the flicker of interest in the students that perhaps you don't with the other two more established figures. So really just kind of reiterating what's been said before. And the other point I wanted to say was that thank you for mentioning about sexual violence and how you might teach that, and the trigger warning for students. I think that's important to say as well, and that has come up in some of my courses. But I also wanted to ask about the consent training. That's not something that I have, I've heard of it, but how might we incorporate that with our student bodies?
Yeah, so I guess I can talk generally. There would probably be people in UCD to give more specific advice on what's going on in UCD, but generally there are two types of training available in institutions. There's consent training, which is largely based on the NUI Galway Active Consent Programme, which is typically offered to students as part of their orientation. And then there's a separate module they can do online later on, which is being rolled out, I think, round about now, actually. And it's very good. It's short, it's colourful, it's interesting. I really like it. And actually, even though it's for students, I think the online module which only takes about an hour, is actually very good for staff as well, because I know certainly when I was a student, I didn't know any of this. Like, I wouldn't know what constituted a sexual assault, for instance. And I wish I did, because it would have been very helpful at the time. And certainly now, if I were teaching students or engaging with them regularly, I'd like to be very well informed so I can help them if someone approaches me for help. The other main type of program is the bystander intervention program, which originated in the UK, and UCD has, I believe, adapted it and come up with a UCD version, which is very good, I've heard, and that is a little more detailed, and it teaches people how to intervene if they see something going on that could be a very low level or could be quite a serious incident. And it's very good for students, I think, especially in social context, to know how to actually safely stop something in its tracks, essentially. And that would be very good, I think, for staff to do also. So essentially, I would recommend keeping an eye out for what's available for staff in UCD, because I think you can actually end up in a situation where students are better informed than staff otherwise. So once everyone gets that level of knowledge up, it's really good in terms of everyone's awareness, in terms of everyone's skills, and then ultimately that's what leads to cultural change, and it'll really be transformative, I think, for institutions. So it's quite an exciting time. There's a lot happening. So the individual I've probably liaised with most in UCD is a man called Rory Carey, and I think there's Annette Quilty, I think, also is another person. So I'm sure Melanie and other colleagues here could put you in touch. But I think it's an exciting area, and I can see, say, with Athena Swan, for instance, sexual violence, sexual consent is going to increasingly become a core component of it. It's been kind of ignored for too long, I think, in Ireland generally, and it's time to make it a priority.
Thank you very much. Useful.
Thank you very much, Eavan. And I see that Bettina added some information about the course on consent in the chat. Okay, I think that we can now move to our next speaker. And our next speaker is Dr. Jen Bond, Assistant Professor in Ancient History at the UCD School of History. And she's going to talk about negotiating gender transnationally.
Thanks so much, Francesco. I'm very happy to be included in this event, and I'm learning so much actually from other colleagues. So thank you for organising this initiative. I'm going to talk to you today about how I teach gender in Chinese history. I'm a historian of modern China, and my research looks at the intersections of class, gender, race, and religion. And I'm going to also then at the end just share some thoughts about how gender and transnational issues play out in the classroom as in my own experience. So I'm interested in colleagues' thoughts. So I'm going to start the slideshow now. So when I'm teaching Chinese gender history, we start off by looking at how historians have theorized gender, and we go right back to canonical thinkers like Jane Scott, who describes gender as a constitutive, sorry, my screen's in the way, gender as a constitutive element of social relationships based on perceived differences between sexes, and gender as a primary relationship, a way of signifying relationships of power. So I've highlighted that as a kind of takeaway that I want students to get out of what how they read Jane Scott, and we discuss this and how it's developed in gender history. Then we look at how do we try and apply what are basically Anglo-European and American-centric notions of gender to the Chinese context, and the problems with doing that. One of the thinkers that I really engaged with in the course is Gail Hershatter, who's actually theorized a much more sensitive and almost humble view of gender, which I find is very useful for when I'm teaching gender history, which is perhaps gender could be thought of instead as an anchoring foothold or handhold, something like the spring-loaded cramming device rock climbers use to scale an unfamiliar rock face. So using gender as a very much more fine-grained tool to help us better understand the historical terrain, something that can be adapted and flexible. And she's a fantastic scholar. I love her use of metaphors. So if anyone's interested, do check out her writing. And then I try to introduce how it's very difficult, actually, when we look at this social, cultural and historical constructed notion of gender that we have in the Anglophone scholarship, and try to apply it to China. In Chinese writing, actually, the characters for what it is to be a man or a woman are very much have implicit gender roles in their formation. So if you look at the character for Nan, male, for example, it's actually composed of the words for field and for the word for strength. So the idea that a man is someone who uses his strength to work outside, and conversely, a woman is somebody composed of the female character and the word for broom. This sort of social roles of gender are very, very much embedded in Chinese characters. I also, challenge them to think about how historically gender roles have been constructed in China, and then how these have played out in lived reality. So examples of primary sources where we see that although women were meant to be in the inner sphere and men in the outer, we get examples of women taking part in all sorts of industries, such as sericulture. They're sorting silkworms, silk cocoons in the left, and ploughing fields on the right. So, challenging the rhetoric versus the realities. I also tell them how actually the idea of a category of woman didn't actually exist in China until the early 20th century. So before that time, you were defined not as a woman, but actually your relationship within the family patriline. So you're either a daughter, new, or a wife, fu. So the word for woman was actually only created from the early 20th century, when Chinese reformers started to think about how could we strengthen China, and looked at women's position in society, and they needed to come up with this concept of what was female. So they came up with 女性, which is literally female sex. Then the communists from the 1920s, also 30s, started to use 妇女 to describe women. So that's another word for woman that has sort of taken off since, and is kind of commonly used in Communist Party historiography of the women's movement. Then you have this problem of gender. So gender doesn't really exist in the Chinese vocabulary. If you have gender on a form in China, it's literally, the common translation is 性别, which actually literally means sex in that biological definition. And it doesn't imply the social, cultural, constructed nature of gender as we think about it in the West. So scholars try to introduce this idea of 社会性别, so social sex, but that doesn't actually work very well in China, and a lot of people will be like, what is that? So translation is a huge issue when we're thinking about how to apply some of these concepts. So how do I teach this? Well, in my courses that look at gender, I teach one at level 3 and a slightly more in-depth one at MA level. We start off by looking at actually how Anglophone scholars have theorized gender. So going Scott, and we look at Butler and Hooks and people who've done this intersectional approach, and Black feminist writers. And then we kind of ask, okay, so what are the problems of trying to impose these ideas of gender into a different cultural context? We look at Wang Zheng, Gail Herschatter, and also see how Chinese conceptions of gender can actually reshape Anglo-American writing and European writing about how we theorize gender. Throughout, I try to get students to keep on thinking about gender as a lens that can actually better help us understand the historical terrain throughout all these changes that happen in Chinese history, and also really encouraging an interdisciplinary approach. For example, students often come to my courses with a really deep interest in gender, and they might have studied it in languages, in English, in social sciences. So I always encourage them to think about how these new ideas about gender they're learning in my courses could intersect with their other understandings of gender. And one student interestingly applied Dr. Geraldine Mona's concept of liberation psychology to the 1911 revolution in China, which I don't think anyone's done before. So I think it was a really nice essay to read, and really to look at how she's trying to see if this would fit the Chinese case. I also, one of my level 3 courses is actually really focusing on memory and warfare and gender. So, I like to consider, things like Gail Herschatter again has talked a lot about how memory is in itself gendered, and how do we treat our primary sources that are implicitly gendered, such as oral history. She says, does memory have a gender? If so, what does it look like and sound like? How do we know that the stories we heard, the judgment of what counts as an event and is worth remembering and telling, were influenced by the gender of the narrator rather than rural residence, personal circumstance, and a host of other factors? So really drawing attention to how to treat gender in our primary sources. Very last slide, penultimate slide. I'm also interested in how this plays out in the classroom today, because I've looked at Chinese women in history who studied in European and American universities, such as this image of Song Bao-sun, who became the first Chinese woman to receive a degree from the University of London. And obviously the challenges that Chinese women faced at the turn of the century are very different to what they face now, but some of the power dynamics I think remain the same. When we're looking at Chinese students in Western classrooms, they have to adapt to a whole new idea about how gender functions in society, if this is between male and female interactions, between professors and students, you know, what kind of eye contact is appropriate, how much you should speak up in class. All that stuff is actually very gendered and culturally defined, and it reminds me of Bell Hook's work on the power of the gaze. So conversely, when I'm teaching Irish students about Chinese gender history, I'm also trying to set some ground rules, you know, how to articulate your views while respecting other cultures who are in the classroom, try to avoid essentializing other cultures. So for example, when we're looking at foot binding, we need to understand, you know, our modern biases from where we're coming from, and try to understand this as, you know, Chinese women in the Ming period might have understood it, and try to avoid making sweeping generalizations about other gender systems, challenging Eurocentric modes of thinking about gender. And also, very importantly in history, when you come across languages, primary sources which have derogatory language, for example, obviously missionaries writing about Chinese women in the 19th and 20th centuries, how to make sure you're distinguishing between your own language that you're using in the classroom and in your essays and the language of the primary sources. So that's something that we kind of lay some ground rules on at the beginning of class, and I'll bring this up in seminars if students are doing that, so that they're aware of it and that's part of their historical training. And then module descriptors, like the previous speaker has just raised, I think trigger warnings are really important actually for sensitive material concerning gendered violence, self-harm. This comes up in my courses, and I put that on my modules descriptors so that students, before they sign up for the module, they know what they're going to get into. If a student doesn't want to do a reading that has a trigger warning, they don't have to. There are other readings that they can do as well. So I leave that as open as possible. And then lastly, I try to also get students excited about this as a new field of research. I run a network for scholars who research gender in China, and I point them towards some of the really exciting new stuff on masculinities, sexualities, and queer studies that are currently going on. And we've recently published a special edition of a journal on that. So I'm going to leave it there, but thank you so much for your attention. I hope we can perhaps discuss some of this.
Thank you very much. Also for being so perfectly in the time of the 10 minutes of the talk. It was great. Now, thank you so much, because it was fascinating focusing and thinking about the relationship also in the construction of gender through the words, to the importance of words and gender. That is also something that will come up, I think, in the next talk by Stephen Lucek. And also thank you for highlighting again the importance of the model descriptors also at the very end of your talk, the importance of the model descriptor as a way to also deal with this kind of aspects. It's important to the presence, or to highlight the presence or the discussion of issues or topics that can be controversial or problematic for some students. So thanks again, Jenny. And questions? Let's see if there are questions. You can ask them directly or write in the chat if you prefer. Yes, Katrina and Gillian.
Hi. Thanks so much, Jennifer. That was so interesting. I'm coming from the language side because I teach Chinese language.
Oh, brilliant.
So your slide on the characters was so exact. I mean, I come across that the same kind of, you know, I do a lot of explaining of what certain characters mean for my students, and even going down to the character for good, as you know, I'm feeling good or whatever. It has one part of the female, one part for a son. So the idea that a female having a son is considered a good thing in Chinese culture, and that's how that character was formed. Just to you know, highlight to maybe other participants here as well, you know, the names, the Chinese names, for example, men's names might have these kind of words for like strong and fierce and brave and courageous, whereas the female would have, you know, words like flower and snow and beauty and things like that, nothing very kind of strong and brave. within those names. So I just thank you for that. It was so interesting. I'm not an expert in the history, but it was really interesting to see that link in the language as well, and something that I'm trying to explain to my students by not, saying traditionally these are how the names are formed, not to say that only males can be strong and brave and courageous, so it was really interesting. So just thank you for that.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, there's that famous story from the Cultural Revolution where Mao Zedong asked one of the students who were attending at Tiananmen Square, "What's your name?" And she says, I can't remember her original name, it's something like very gendered and feminine and soft. And she said, "Oh, you don't want a name like that, you want a name that means wants violence." So he renames her wants violence, and that's a nice anecdote I often use to teach students about how we can explain the violence of the Cultural Revolution and the gendered aspects of that violence actually as well.
Julia.
Thanks very much, Jenny. There were so many interesting things to think about there. I'm going away thinking about whether memory has a gender, for example. I just think that's such a fascinating thing to think about. But I actually just wanted to ask you about classroom practice, because I would really like to know more about how you go about training your students or helping them to avoid essentializing other cultures during your classroom discussions and in their writing. Do you have anything practical that you could suggest?
Thanks, Gillian. Yeah, this is something that I've actually started really thinking about in more recent times, because I've coming quite recently from my PhD to UCD, and I think it's just important that you perhaps lay that out at the beginning of the session and just lay down some ground rules about how to tackle those issues in the primary sources, and also call it out when someone does it inadvertently. You might not want to cause effect. You're not trying to make that other student feel bad, but it's important that they're aware of what they're doing. So I think not mentioning it is actually not good, because it doesn't highlight to the students that they can't make really general broad assumptions, and how, especially when you have a mixture of Chinese, half Chinese students in the classroom with Irish students, and it's quite a difficult thing, and actually it's still something I'm trying to think through myself actually. So I think it's really important to do. Sorry, that's not very practical, but yeah, that's I'm interested to hear other colleagues' thoughts on it.
Any other questions? Athena, you want to say something?
I'm muted. Yeah, maybe I can come in on that, because I teach linguistics at UCD, but I often have this because I might be talking about like gender stereotypes and language and so on and so forth, and then people start essentializing also around class, for example. That's my main problem, and I think it's a good idea to lay down ground rules. I have started doing, because otherwise you have this problem in class. But one thing that I have also asked students to do is basically I give them the questions at some stage and ask them, well, how would you be, like, which gender would you explain the concept of gender, for example, and I ask them, can you self-identify which one it is? So people then, okay, are you a lad or are you a metrosexual, and so on. So, and that can be also done for cultural matters. So that is one way of doing it, because sometimes people like it. Nowadays, I notice students like to go back to themselves and then present themselves, but some students might just not want to do that. But when they do it in group work, I find the results come often quite good if you don't do it in a plenary talk, for example. But I do really like, coming back to your presentation, this intersectionality approach that you take, basically saying, look, there is gender and this notion of femininity, and they are quite different across cultures, because I think there's too much, especially from the West, there's always this view that, oh no, everything is the same, and if you don't take our Western view, then there's something utterly wrong. And I hear that a lot, and I think it's very important that we basically sensitize students very early to the views that our views are very positioned in a particular social and cultural context, and we need to make this very clear to the students, because obviously they're often not aware of that, because they come from a context maybe where that was never an issue. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I think it's really important. And, you know, just from there, you know, maybe even getting students to go to places that they've never thought of going before, you know, to sort of broaden their understandings and horizons. You can't really understand where you're coming from and where someone else is coming from until you've tried to sort of engage with it in a more direct way. Yeah.
I mean, maybe if I can come in for one second. When I did field research for my PhD, I was in this little village in the Amazon rainforest. And one thing I was not prepared for was the gender stereotypes that people put on me. I spent probably a month feeling really terrible, where, you know, there was this idea of women being put in the very domestic sphere, or, you know, certain sexual demands and so on. It was really scary. And now thinking back, I'm thinking, how did my dissertation supervisor allow me to just go there and figure this out? So what I do nowadays, for example, because when I do allow people to go out for field work, I do say to them, look, you will be confronted with these stereotypes. You will have to develop positions about it, but you also have to work with, okay, this is how far I can go, but I can't go further. And these things are actually much more important. And, you know, I think we often don't think about that either, especially when we send them to other cultures, because the things you like suddenly discover can be quite painful for students. So then needs to be preparation for that now. And I remember I did that for a student, and then she went out somewhere in a Pacific island, and after a month she wrote me an email. She said, look, I can hardly sustain myself because I just can't stand the way I'm being positioned as a woman. And, you know, it is something that is very important to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important training, and also it works both ways. Like I've known Chinese students who've come across to the UK in particular, and been just really thrown by the way in which men treat women here as well. So it really is, yeah, it's really reciprocal. But I think it's important to be aware of and train people for.
We have one question here in the comment section. It's just, you mentioned that Chinese lacks a word for gender, but I wonder if you came across non-binary sex terms.
That's such a really interesting question, because actually the pronouns in Chinese, him and her, are not, if you say it ta, it doesn't imply a gender, the spoken language. So in that way, speaking, you don't know if it's male or female ta, but so Chinese students in the UK also often mix up his and her in their language acquisition in English, but it's gendered in the written form. There's a female ta with a new radical and a male ta. Actually, that only came in the early 20th century. Before that, writers were using a gender neutral ta. So it's very interesting to see that in Chinese history, how gender becomes this important category for reformers as well when they're writing about women. So in some ways, yeah, there's some really interesting stuff that you could do with being gender neutral and going back to that other ta, which didn't have an implicit gender in it. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we go on, Francesco? Okay, so then I introduce our next speaker, which is Dr. Stephen Lucek. And Stephen is a postdoc in the School of Languages, Cultures and Linguistics at UCD. And he will tell us a bit more about pronouns in the classroom.
Great, thanks so much, Melanie. Thanks everyone for coming out today. It's hard to forget these turns of phrases we have in our vocabulary for face-to-face times. But I'd like to thank as well the other speakers today. It's been a really fascinating and illuminating series of talks. I want to talk a little bit about classroom interaction, and so I'll look a little bit about how gender is approached, how sex is approached in the classroom, and look at what we do in higher education, and certainly some of the complicating factors that we as educators will face. So yeah, there we go, a little bit of an outline there. The only one today using the official UCD PowerPoint template, so shame on all of you. So we'll talk a little bit about what we study in linguistics as gendered language, a little bit about non-binary gender identity, and then some classroom dynamics and what we can do as educators to reduce stress and inequalities. So as a number of you no doubt have small children at home, homeschooling has been interesting, and my junior infant's child is, this was from last week, looking at the letter R, the number 7, the sound G, but then here are tricky words, are he and she. Well, for a 5-year-old, these are tricky words, but these can be very tricky for people of our age as well, because these simple gender binaries that a lot of us grew up with are more and more being looked at as being quite limiting, and another area where we can see the need for inclusion in all contexts. So university life is no different. In linguistics, we approach biological sex and gender identity as being very, very different things. I think that's been a common theme so far today. We see gender as an identity category. It's intersectional with other types of our social backgrounds, but it's certainly something that is acquired throughout our lives. We're not the same people at 7 years of age as we are at 40, and we certainly don't use the same types of language as we do from those various points in our lives. But again, it's something that we can craft and curate. Our gender identity is no different than our other types of identity. As an Irish person, as an American, as a Polish person, we create different types of identity through the language that we use, and indeed the language that we don't use. That could be just as important. We look at things as direct or indirect indexes of gender in language. So there's a very small set, in English anyway, of directly indexed terms. So words for kinship, aunt and uncle, son and daughter, personal pronouns, and morphology. Sometimes we think about a host and a hostess in a restaurant. It's still fairly common to see these sorts of binaries between male and female in the morphology of English. Other varieties of English, for example, Indian English, will be a bit more wide-ranging in the number of professions that are marked by gender. German certainly does this as well. And so we're more likely to see social practices as indirectly linking gender categories. And the example here are different types of linguistic practices that can index a certain type of woman or man, male or female. So the co-occurrence of women swearing as well as hypercorrection. And we've 50 years worth of literature to look at here. But these are some of the types of linguistic practices we see as being gendered in some way, in most cases, indirectly indexed. A very popular study for us to show in sociolinguistics is Peter Trudgill's study of Norwich, where he looked at this, again, intersectional study of working class women, working class men, middle class women, and middle class men, and how frequently they were using the variant in instead of ing, so running or run-in, and in a very formal type of language, we call here the reading passage. I'm gonna get myself a little pen here. A very, very formal type of language, we see the middle class women, which is the triangle with the dots, 0%. So nobody there was saying run in, talk in. They're saying running, talking. And we see as we get less and less formal, reading passage, formal speech, but casual speech, people are much more likely to let their guards down, pay a little less attention to the types of language that we use. This is the sort of stuff we talk about in sociolinguistics. I'm sure our colleagues in the School of Languages, Cultures and Linguistics hear quite enough of it from us. But we see that there is a difference here between what women are doing and what men are doing in both categories, both amongst the working class and the middle class. So there's a perception then, certainly in 1972, that women and men behave differently linguistically, that we do things from the point of view of what is the prestige variant, what is the more standard type of speech. So running would be the more standard speech. So in this time, we were probably hearing a lot more about women using standard forms or correct forms. They're hypercorrect, but also there's these politeness notions of not using swear words, which has certainly been examined for quite a long time. Sex and gender are the most frequently studied social factors in linguistics and social linguistics. So as we get closer to the 21st century, we start to get into this idea that, well, you know, maybe the Trudgills of the world, the early sociolinguists in the 70s, maybe they were underselling the intersectionality, because yes, middle class and working class works with gender, but also different types of males and females do things differently. So a paragon of feminist literature and linguistics here, Deborah Cameron, talks about it. It's a myth to think about differences between sex. It's a myth to think that men do things differently than women simply because they're men or women. It's more of a social construct of gender, and Mary Buchholz there, and Penny Eckert and Sally McConnell-Genet. Types of females and types of males, however, the more we research, the more we construe these categories, is again insufficient, because trans-star inclusion requires us to be a little bit more understanding of fluidity as citizens anyway, and certainly as educators of young minds. So the reformulation of a binarity of an identity is necessary. So gender identity becomes much more fluid, but also less binary, less ones and zeros. And we see some very establishment-y, very conservative groups saying, well, you know what, this is actually something we do need to consider. So the Wall Street Journal now, will include MX for a title instead of Mr. or Mrs. Ms. MX is there. The APA now acknowledges singular they. They didn't really have to acknowledge it because singular they has been around since the 14th century. But we have different ways of understanding non-binary pronouns. And so we have el, we have they, we have hen. This is different ways of looking at what we think of as gendered languages, Spanish, French, German, and saying that, well, yeah, well, just because we put genders on nouns doesn't mean that there is a binarity, certainly amongst human beings, and maybe it's something we need to consider. Because it's not a binary relationship. Arapesh, language spoken in Papua New Guinea, has 13 different genders, and that is a highly diverse gendered type of language. And we see here, this is something I saw over the summer a friend went for a COVID test, and this is from the HSC. If Richard still feels unwell, they should contact their GP. So yeah, you know what, maybe we are getting somewhere with singular they from an official source. So what are we doing as educators, as people in front of rooms with young people and not so young people who may not see gender as a binary either? Gender in the classroom is also a highly researched subject. We can look at how gender equality has always been a problem, certainly since we've been looking at it. 50 years of research here again, where teachers are more likely to call on boys than girls. Assumptions about feminine subjects and masculine subjects in school, where most of us are from the College of Arts and Humanities. We certainly see this simply by looking at the breakdowns of who is enrolled on our courses. But this extends a little bit further. Boys are seen as being more disruptive or less motivated in school, and this can have far-reaching impacts here. The Gilahan paper looks at their higher levels of diagnoses, higher numbers, are more likely to be, boys are more likely to be diagnosed as ADHD, ADD, or being on the autism spectrum than girls, as it manifests differently amongst boys, and teachers are trained to recognize those particular types of indications. Now I know I'm going a bit close to time here, so recent studies have shown this an adaptation in the classroom towards non-binary gender identities. So the Wendling study shows that there's 50% of the sample of university students say that their university recognizes their pronouns. All of the young people in that study were trans, so that's quite significant. And there's a significant divide there between those that were identifying transnormatively as he, him, or she, her, and the trans queer approaches of CG, here, them, they, where it's generally avoided. We also looked there, there's a slightly older study of how lecturers are willing to correct generic he, she from their students. And one of the reasons being that they don't seem to be aware or as aware of grammatical correctness. And this is one of the bugbears of certain people who resist singular they, is that it is difficult to form singular they in grammatical constructs. So this is certainly nearly 20 years old, 15 years old. This particular study, I think if we went back and did this again, we would have a lot more acceptance amongst lecturers, young and old. So what are some of the things that we can do? Support pronoun disclosure, because not everyone is going to want to disclose their pronouns, but it's important for us to provide young people, provide our students with the forum to do so. So they may ask to be acknowledged with their chosen name or their chosen pronouns, they may not, but providing that space for disclosure is important. And something else that we can do is regularize pronoun disclosure. I myself include on my Twitter profile and in my email signatures my pronouns. So it becomes a less stigmatized practice if everybody says, these are my pronouns, to allow, again, that safer space for people to list their pronouns, which may not be binary. Introduce students to this notion that singular they is out there. It's an inclusive practice. We use it a lot in linguistics when we're trying to preserve identities in our research. And anybody who works with human subjects knows that that can be an issue. So singular they is just natural to a lot of us. But it is an inclusive practice, and students can participate in that, certainly in their writing and their oral work. And also, this is the bigger question for universities, is to address a non-binarity in admissions, and a huge issue here becomes on-campus housing. UCD, as we see, or don't see as the case may be, has a strong emphasis on providing on-campus housing for as many students as possible. Well, then gender identity has to become a more nuanced and less binary experience here. And we need to look at gender identity from a far more macro point of view. And it can fit inside the existing EDI infrastructures. But as Ursula was showing us earlier, it's not always understood quite how to go about addressing non-binarity. UCD obviously made quite a lot of news a few years ago when we introduced our non-gendered toilets. Hurrah. And also think about reporting structures as being different. So here are some resources. International Pronouns Day is the third Wednesday of October. Each year, they have great resources, and this is just one example of how to introduce yourself to gender pronouns that are not on the binary scale. Couple papers there. But it is important for us to acknowledge and understand that gender identity is like any other type of identity. We need to be inclusive and welcoming of people expressing it. Because it's that time of year, I have a poem for you to end. Roses are red, violets are blue. Singular they predates singular you. So thanks very much, everyone. I appreciate the time, which I have gobbled up greedily.
A little bit, yes. Thank you so much, Stephen. It was really, really important, also particularly for us that work with languages, that I think that it's very important to think about this aspect also in our teaching. So thanks again, because it was really, really important and interesting. Questions for Steve? Again, either in the chat, Eavan? Yes, please. And your microphone, Eavan?
I hate to use this line of less of a question, more of a comment, because that usually means there's a kind of rant coming, and there isn't here at all. Just the comment that I think in language teaching, actually in foreign language teaching or in Irish language teaching, where like as in German, you know, the word for girl is neuter, and French, the word for table is feminine, and it's masculine in German. And so there's lots of scope actually for just airing that separation between gender and destiny in a fairly kind of uncontentious, I suppose, way for people in a classroom. You know, we've got I think probably most of the Latin languages are similar to, where, you know, possessive pronouns take their gender from the thing possessed and not from the possessor, that kind of thing. Object pronouns, indirect object pronouns, lui in French, and the other languages I'm not even going to risk it, are neutral. So I think it's, you know, I suppose those of us teaching languages have been in a position, whether we've kind of taken it up or not, to expose students to that kind of simple fact, you know, that gender and essence, I mean, gender is not essence.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I think, as Eavan noted, I'm happy to take questions off air as well. I'm easy to find on the directory. So in the interest of moving things along, perhaps.
I don't know. Bettina, do you want to ask something?
Well, I just wanted to ask, do you think it makes sense, you know, a lot of continental European language, for example, have now developed all these non-sexist language use rules and so on. English has some of that as well. It is something that is an important part of each of those languages' history. Do you think this should constitute an integral part of language teaching, or even at secondary school? Should children in school, say in English, learn about how to speak non-sexist in a non-sexist way, or should they know that there is Ms. as opposed to Mrs. and Miss, for example? Do you think this would be an important step towards helping some of those matters?
I think certainly by discussing these matters, it can only help. I think by introducing the notion that in primary school, as the example goes, we could introduce students, young people, to the idea that gender is not a binary, because inevitably they will, as you know, modern human beings, this is something that they will encounter. And it's not like they wouldn't have encountered it 50 years ago, but people are a lot more open and interested in sharing those aspects of their experience. So why would we want to have young people who are unprepared for that, who don't know that there's such a thing as someone who's transgender? I mean, it seems natural that if you can teach a 5-year-old that there's such a thing as a giraffe that they may never see, well, why don't we teach them that there are other types of people in the world, anti-racist training in school as well. These are all things that we should be doing from an early age, and it demystifies problems that can arise. It demystifies othering of any type in life. And
yeah, thanks.
Okay, Siobhan, and then Jay.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and I love that poem at the end. Emer, I was really intrigued what you were saying about pronouns, and essentially I agree, but then I was thinking this whole thing with they and the plural and the singular, which I know I struggle with, but that's just me. I mean, could that at some point, and I accept that it goes back, so that's really interesting, but could that at some point make it also harder for people learning languages? So that, I mean, in German, and I presume in other languages, we're always talking about verb agreement, you know? So in German, then you have sie, S-I-E, which can mean the singular she, or the feminine it, or it can mean the plural they, or it can mean other, you know, cases, obviously. So is it going to potentially be harder for us to sort of hammer home, do you see what I mean? The difference between she is, or it is, or they is, and they are in the plural. I mean, I don't mean to end on a negative note, but do you understand what I'm saying? I'm just kind of wondering, is there something more we should be doing in order to point out grammatical correctness in that extent, and yet gender equality on the other? Does that make sense?
I think that's the, no, sorry, Emer, go ahead there.
Your microphone. Yeah. No, the microphone.
You're still muted. Microphone.
Okay. Now I'm unmuted. Yeah, absolutely. I suppose just all I was saying was that the question is live when you're in language teaching, and the difficulties of resolving it remain. And in the way, whether it's that, you know, you're kind of going against maybe majority cultural norms in terms of recognition of identity, or majority cultural norms in terms of correct speech. You know, maybe they're all kind of part of the same big minefield, you know, that we're negotiating. But really, I was just kind of saying, yes, it's something that we have the opportunity to you know, be be sensitive to, I suppose. Stephen will have something much more thoughtful to say, I think.
Yeah, no, I get that. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, languages are languages, and there are always, you know, difficulties in learning any language. So I wouldn't want to assume that it would be more difficult or less difficult to teach a language, but it certainly is a consideration. But sure, that's what language change is all about. Maybe that's the linguist in me coming out, rearing its ugly head, but we just do. I mean, language is a social practice. And if we don't reflect that social practice in pedagogy, there's no point.
I mean, there's a lot of discussion, especially in German, about gender neutral and non-gender. It's a huge, I mean, like even the Duden publishes about it right now. And I think, you know, I actually read this, and I think it would be kind of something very nice to show to the students, say, look, the history of it, and here are the different proposals, and why have they been made, and why are they different from English? Because German is a different language. I think it would be a very nice discussion, and I think it is politically important, because if you don't use some of these forms and do the correct forms, as in whatever they were traditionally there, you could be politically positioning yourself in a very awful way that you don't want to. So at least make it aware to the students that there is this thing.
Yeah,
I have always had that for English. When I talk about these things in my linguistics classes, where a lot of students didn't really initially understand that Ms. is an option and what that option means, because a lot of Irish students thought it means everybody who doesn't fit the mold, right? They're too old to be Miss, they're not married, they're divorced and all of that. And I said, hello, this is an Irish interpretation, but there are other interpretations in other countries around this. And for them, this was kind of like, wow, I didn't know there's all of this. So it also showed them about moving, how gender stereotypes are moving, or how they are locally fixed. So I think this notion of correctness might be the problem, because you might fix them to traditionalness, which might not be something that they want.
It's kind of an argument for embedding language teaching, if we're talking about language teaching, in you know, a cultural kind of context, which is, I think, what a lot of us try to do, especially as we go through the years. And we've talked about écriture inclusive in French and final year language, and you know, which is like creating ructions in a certain, you know, certain context in France. But it's that bigger thing of, you know, and then I suppose being able to almost speak multiple languages, the way that those Norwich women were. I was really struck by the sharpness of the curve, or of the line for the women, much more than the men. It's like the women spoke two different languages almost. You know, they had their ins for their chats, and then they had their ings to a much greater degree. So all of, I mean, that's, I suppose that's your sociolinguistic point, you know, too. But I think we do, you know, need, and I think a lot of us do actually try to bring together the kind of teaching of foreign languages with the cultural environment that those languages happen in and change in as they go through the years, maybe not in first year, but, you know, second year and final year.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't want to cut the discussion, but there are some times that we have to respect. I know that Gillian has a question, if it's a very quick one, otherwise we can move at the end as you prefer. No, your microphone.
It was a quick question, but the answer might not be. But the answer might not.
Don't worry.
Just very brief. I wanted to kind of turn what Bettina said slightly on its head, in the sense, as a parent of teenagers who are actually very quick to correct me when I'm not being inclusive enough, or I'm not being correct, and I'm always happy to learn new things for them. And a couple of things have happened recently that made me feel that our institution actually needs to do an awful lot of catching up in this regard. And I was just wondering, Stephen, if we made you president for a day, what would you do? What would you change? You know, what would be one of your sort of maybe first two actions to try to do something about it in UCD? What could we do better? pronoun-wise?
Oh, I mean, the first thing you do on your one day as president is grant yourself 364 more days as president, probably.
In terms of pronouns, though, would you, how would you kind of begin to overhaul our outdated system?
Well, UMT did approve a gender inclusivity policy in 2007, 2017. Sorry, it is a little bit more recent than that. These things should be living documents, and if you've dealt with the official documents, usually there is a long list of revisions, but that hasn't been revised. It was drafted once, and it lives there now. It doesn't really address how to equitably deal with anything other than he, she binarity. So yeah, I think things are done usually in the university from a steering committee and a project team. So I think faculty need training as much as students do. That's probably obvious to us all, but yeah, a greater awareness of inclusive practices from any point of view, whether it's gendered pronouns or otherwise, can always be used. And, we shouldn't shy away from these things. We should be leading on these efforts.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve, again for your talk. And now the next speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Shotton, Associate Professor at UCD School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy. And the theme is, I'm not a woman architect. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Francesco. I will start this by saying when I saw the lineup of all the titles for the lectures, I asked Francesco whether I really belonged on this list. The lectures have been very thoughtful and based on a good deal of research and consideration. And I should make it clear that my lecture is really a personal reaction to the question posed, very much based on my lived experience. And I am aware from working in EDI about the problems that students of several genders have about harassment and bullying, and that we need to find a solution to it. And I really appreciate the last lecture from Stephen. I think there is something around pronouns and making them more commonly understood that might help. I'm not sure about curriculum changes to the curriculum, but everything that I say is based on my experience of working in the College of Engineering and Architecture, which is quite different from literature. So I'll share my screen now with you. Can you all see that? Okay. So I teach in the School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy. I am a professional architect. I'm also a woman, but I would like to state unequivocally that I am not a woman architect. This is a real button for me that gets me very upset. And it's that woman architect that aggravates me. And that term has been used for as long as I can remember. I've been an architect for 35 years. I've had it used in relationship to me as well as other people. And when I first graduated, in fact, there was a group of women who graduated around the same time as I did, who started a group for women architects. And they asked me to join the group, of course. And I said no, and I said no for very specific reasons. I mean, their idea was to support each other in a profession where there were very few women working. So the idea of support was not wrong, but the idea of what they were calling themselves, I felt was very wrong. Women architects. Because the term you never hear is man architect, nor do you hear men architects. In fact, it's jarring, both those terms, man architect and men architects. But woman architect seems fine and commonly used. In fact, in an earlier lecture today, we heard woman writers. And I would argue the same thing applies to women writers as applies to women architects, because man architect doesn't make sense. And yet the word architect, by definition, is a person, not a man or a woman, but a person who designs buildings and in many cases supervises their construction. So why in the world do we qualify that term with gender? I would argue the reason we qualify that term with gender is because implicit in our culture is an accepted definition of architect that means man who designs buildings, not person. And therefore, in order to apply that term to me, you have to qualify that term with my gender. And I find that inexcusable, because I think I own that word as much as a man does. The same thing happens with the term engineer. Woman engineer is a common term. It's heard all the time. Man engineer is never used. And all the men engineers, and I think there is at least one male engineer on this session, would probably object to being called a man engineer, because they know that that word belongs to them. And yet it doesn't belong to them. It belongs to any person whose job involves designing and building engines, machines, roads, bridges, etc. Not a man or a woman, but any person. And so my question is, why do we continue to qualify any of these words, scientist, doctor, architect, engineer, poet? Why do we add a gender designation in front of them? Because in doing that, we cede ownership of those words to men. And it's not just the male-female divide. I have been in meetings where I've heard the term trans poet used. I actually looked it up online to make sure. If trans poet is appropriate, then I would argue we have to use cis poet as well. Because if we don't say cis poet for everybody else, then we have ceded the ownership of the word poet to cis men and women. And I think that's unacceptable. So then I ran through another few alternatives. I mean, maybe female architect is okay because male architect sounds okay. But if you're going to refer to me as a female architect, then I insist you refer to all the men who are architects as male architects, rather than giving them ownership over that word. On the other hand, we could just stop talking about architects as people and start talking about architecture as a discipline, architecture as buildings in the world. So could we talk about architecture designed by women? Which means we also have to talk about architecture designed by men. But the question is, why are we having to talk about architecture designed by men or women or any other gender? Is it because we want to give our students role models to follow? so that a woman studying architecture can see themselves in that profession because they see other women in that profession? Is that why we're doing that? Or is it because we want to ensure that we discuss all the range of different types of people who actually contribute to architecture, to the making of architecture? Either of those things might be valid, although I'm not sure about the role model, and I'll get to that later. The problem is with architecture, and this is not true of literature, so it doesn't apply to all of you out there, but architecture is not designed by a single person, although there is a lie in architecture that attributes buildings to sole authors, to singular geniuses. And that's true in the historical record, and it's true in the contemporary press. And it's disabling both for the profession and for students learning, because architecture is not undertaken by a single person, not even a sole practitioner practicing architecture in the basement. It's never done by a sole person. It's always done by teams. It's always architects, engineers, contractors, subcontractors, building authorities, planners, clients. There's always a team behind the building of any piece of architecture. And that's true of any type of engineering as well. So in fact, you can't talk about gender in terms of architecture because there are no sole authors. So there is no fixed gender. So then I come back to the idea of role models. And I think about when I was a student in architecture looking for role models. Well, the truth is I mostly didn't look at the architects, I looked at the architecture. But if I looked at the architects, it's only because I was trying to find somebody who had attributes, who had skills, spatial skills, technical skills, collaborative skills that I admired, which actually have nothing to do with their gender and has more to do with the team of people that they're working with. The teams that remain relatively invisible, in fact, because of the great lie about the sole author. I am an architect, and I am a woman, but I am offended when somebody squeezes the word woman in front of architect, because I have a right to the ownership of that word. Not only because I trained as an architect, I pay annual dues every year to be professionally recognized as an architect. And I will not have men own that word by having somebody qualify that word with my gender, because my gender has nothing to do with the fact that I'm an architect. The only things relevant to my practice as an architect are the skills I possess and not my gender. So I think in architecture and engineering, gender becomes not the point. There might be a reason to talk about women who have worked within the field. Maybe there's a course about that, but it's not about how architecture is practiced. Anyways, I would just like to end on that I am an architect. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for this presentation that introduces a different perspective or a different approach. Any question? I cannot see, sorry. Okay, maybe. Okay. Questions? Ursula, yes, please.
It's not a question, it's an observation, and I don't want, as Eavan said earlier, I don't want that to seem confrontational in any way. I'm thinking about the context, I suppose, that many of us are working in the School of Languages and Linguistics and so on. So when we talk, say, for instance, when I use the term woman writer, I'm thinking also in terms of how that is expressed in Italian. So you have scrittori and you have scrittrici, and the term is gendered. And invariably, scrittore is used as a collective masculine noun, which is meant to encapsulate both men and women writers. But if one is talking, and it's very often the case that when a woman writer, to use that term, is being talked about, she's always going to be referred to as a scrittrice because of the fact that she is gender female. So the term for a new writer who is a woman will always be scrittrice. A new writer who is a man will always be scrittore. And it's only when they're being talked about together that the masculine prevails. And we were talking about the prevalence of the masculine as a kind of a collective, if you like, a supposedly gender neutral collective, which it actually isn't. So that's kind of interesting. But the same debate comes up again and again, actually, in the Italian context. There are an awful lot of Italian writers who are female who would dispute the term scrittrice because of the kind of connotations that it has, really. It has connotations of sentimentality, it has connotations of lesserness, because the canon is canonically, by definition, has been male. So it's a really contested term, I suppose, really, in an Italian context as well. I'm sure the case is similar in other languages. But I'll come back as well to French, just thinking there as well, and thinking about Jeanette, and one of the things that he says in paratext. And it's just a very interesting question that he poses, which is not, it's specifically about novels. And he says, do we ever read a novel by a woman in the same way that we read a novel plain and simple, that is, a novel by a man? And that's an extraordinary question, but underneath that question, there are a lot of suppositions and assumptions that really need to be interrogated, about what a novel is to start with, and about what a writer is, and how you define writers, and where gender comes into play in that. So it's a really vexed question, I think, but it's one that has really very particular roots in languages that depend on gender in the way that the Romance languages do. So that's just my tuppence halfpenny worth, but I'm sure other people have things to say as well.
It's an interesting question. I recently read a book by a woman writer who was writing from the first person male. And I kind of wondered about that actually after I had read it. And then I thought, well, there's probably been any number of male authors who have written from a female perspective. So why am I questioning that? I would be grateful actually if I didn't know the gender of the writer, if they just somehow muted their genders in the way they show their name, so that I don't have to deal with their gender and I can just interact with the writing very directly. I appreciate the rationale for why you say woman writer, which is obviously based on very clear rationale. And I can't speak to writers and how they feel about having their designation gendered or qualified. All I'm saying, everything that I'm saying is really only possibly applicable within the universe of architecture and engineering, and maybe a few other places, but I'm only talking about my small universe, where I think distinguishing gender is really problematic because it leads in some respects to what you were saying about those books. Are people going to look at the work done by women differently than the work done by men? And yet it's the same kind of skill sets. And so the gender is really not relevant.
I see there is a question by Amanda. Then I should leave the other questions at the end if it is fine, because we have another speaker. Okay, so we will continue then the discussion at the end.
Thanks,
Amanda,
Francesco.
yes, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Beth, for the talk. It was very interesting. And I think I also belong in that small realm of architects and engineers. I just wondered, there's one thing you said about the fact, in terms of role models, and I just query, I think you know, some of the research has shown that having role models, say, for students before they come to college in an area that maybe not usual for females to go into can help to show them that there's a way that females are engineers, for example. And oftentimes, you know, having females going out to schools to talk about engineering and things like that is something that we will do in order to try and encourage females to take up engineering. Now, I suppose architecture, you're probably 50-50 in terms of your entry of females and males into the profession. So it probably doesn't need that to happen in order to encourage females to come and study architecture. But would you say that the role model is an important distinction when you're talking about encouraging students to come to study the profession in engineering?
Well, I actually wouldn't distinguish between engineering and architecture, because I think role models probably are important. I guess there are a couple of things that I would unpack there. First, I think it is important for young women coming into either of these programs to realize that there are women within these disciplines. So having women go out to schools is fine. But to describe themselves as women engineers or women architects is wrong, because we give all the men the rights to the word. So I would object to that. But I also think the problem in both architecture and engineering is you can't really point at a building or point at a bridge and say, a woman did that. I know it's done. I know people talk about architecture done by Shelley McNamara and Yvonne Farrell of Grafton Architects. But in fact, that work is done by a huge team of people in their office, men, women, gay people, trans people. It's not done by women. And so you can't point at pieces of architecture or pieces of engineering and say, that was done by a woman, that was done by a man. I think that's really misleading, this is less of a problem in engineering, I think, but in architecture, it supports the lie of the single genius, which I think is as damaging as qualifying the term architect or engineer. So if we're going to talk about people who practice architecture or engineering and the different genders of people, maybe there's a context within the curriculum that you do that, but I don't think you do it by assigning gender authorship to the artifacts that we create. I also don't know about the role models. When I look for a role model, I look for people who have particular skills, and I don't think a woman, when I look for a role model, as a woman, when I look for a role model, I look for a woman who has bucked the trend in society and hasn't gotten married and hasn't had children. I need those kind of role models. They're few and far between. But when I look for a role model as an architect, I'm not thinking about gender. I'm thinking about their skill set. I'm not sure the two things are bound up together.
Yeah, maybe role model is the wrong word then. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. So I think we just continue now to the next speaker, which is Orla Doyle. And if you have any other questions, I mean, we're happy to stay on afterwards and have more discussions. So next up is Orla Doyle, who is Associate Professor in the School of Economics, and she will talk about improving diversity in economics.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, my name's Orla. I'm from the School of Economics, and thank you for asking me to present today. I should say I'm supposed to be teaching right now. I have a class at 2 o'clock. So I've actually emailed my students and told them I'm going to be starting 15 minutes late, but I'm going to have to shorten my presentation. So sorry about that, because I have to go and teach. But I'll get through this quickly enough. I'm going to skip the first part of my presentation, which is just about how women are underrepresented in economics. And I'm going to talk about a study. That's what I really wanted to talk about anyway. So We got our Athena Swan Bronze Award in March of last year. And as part of that, we've been conducting a number of studies. And the one I want to talk to you about today is particularly about the module descriptors. And I know a number of people in the presentations have been talking about the module descriptors so far. So what we wanted to do was conduct a study of our module descriptors, in particularly in light of the female enrollment rate, and whether how we kind of write our module descriptors will attract or distract women to, or whatever the opposite of that is, will either attract women or not to take up that module. So the key questions that we wanted to address was, is the gender of the module coordinator associated with the female enrollment rate? So basically, our hypothesis there to test was, are females more likely to choose to do a module that has a female module coordinator? Secondly, we want to look at, is the type of assessment and feedback mechanism associated with the female enrollment rate? So it might be that particular types of assessment are more attractive to certain genders or not, and that's something we wanted to test. But the main part of this study really was to look at whether the module descriptor in-text masculinity score was associated with the female enrollment rate. So essentially what we did was we took all level 1 and level 2 econ modules from InfoHub. This is what the students see. And we ran them through a gender analytics software that essentially gives the gender or the module descriptors a score of how masculine or not they are in terms of the language that they use. And we did this for 44 of our elective modules and 21 of our core modules. For those of you who don't know, I'm sure you all do know, this is what a module descriptor typically looks like. And here's just some of the summary statistics. So the female enrollment rate in our modules is about 35%. So as you can see, there's a huge underrepresentation of women in economics. So it's about 35%. In terms of the gender of the coordinator, we see that 50% of our lecturers are female and 50% are men, which is incredibly unusual in economics. Every other department of economics has a much a lower proportion of females in their school. So we're doing quite well there. In terms of assessment techniques, the majority of people have a final exam, 55%, 14% have midterms, 7% of essays, and 25% of some other type of assessment. In terms of whether individual feedback is offered or not, the majority does that. So 59% almost of module descriptors say that the lecturer is going to provide one-on-one feedback to the students. I was interested in this. It's the word count of module descriptors. So the average word count of the module descriptors was 232 words, but you can see here that there's a wide range of variety in the number of words. So some are pretty sparse, 63 words, and some have 500 words. In terms of our masculinity in-text score, we see that it's 61%. So again, the majority, more than half at least of the module descriptors are kind of focusing more on using words that are associated with masculine rather than feminine words. So we estimated a number of really, really simple models. There's nothing complicated here. The dependent variable that we want to explain is the proportion of females who are enrolled in the module. In our first model here, we're looking at whether or not the gender of the lecturer influences the female enrollment rate. You can see that the coefficient is positive, but it's not statistically significant. So again, it's saying that there's no relationship between the gender of the lecturer and the female enrollment rate in that module. In the second model, I should say, we then also include a control of whether or not the module provides individual feedback or not. And again, it's not statistically significant. In model 3, then we include this masculinity in-text score, and it's not statistically significant, but you do see that it has this negative coefficient. So what that means is that the female enrollment rate tends to be lower in courses that have a higher masculinity score in the module descriptor, which is somewhat what we would have hypothesized. Interestingly, in model 3, you can also see now that the individual feedback offering is now statistically significant. So what that suggests is that in the female enrollment rate tends to be higher when individual feedback is going to be provided to the students. And then in the final model, we just included for word count, and it didn't have any effect, so it's not statistically significant. Next up then, we wanted to focus specifically on the female coordinator's behavior and whether or not when we compare the text of female and male module coordinators, if they differ. So the first thing we looked at was the masculinity score. And again, we don't find any statistically significant relationships, but we do find a negative coefficient, which is what we would expect. So what this tells us is that female module coordinators use less masculine language to describe their modules compared to males, which is, I guess, something we would expect. We also found that a positive coefficient between female coordinators and the use of individual feedback. So again, suggesting that female module coordinators are more likely to provide individual feedback to students as well. So just to summarize this very small study that we did, we found that the female enrollment rate is unrelated to the gender of the lecturer. So the female enrollment in all modules is about 35%. And then when we just look at the female enrollment rate in modules run by females, it's also 35%, which is somewhat good news. We also saw that female module coordinators use slightly less masculine words in their module descriptors, but there's not that much of a difference, to be honest. So the overall module descriptors are 61% and the female module descriptors are 59%. So again, not much of a difference there. And we also found that female coordinators are somewhat more likely to provide individual feedback to students, and this attracts females to take the course. Now, there are some limitations, obviously, with this study. We have a very small sample size. The analysis I showed you is based on just the 44 elective modules, because obviously core modules all students have to take. There's no element of choice there. So we focus this only on those 44 elective modules. So small sample size means it's harder for us to find statistically significant relationships. And finally, some module coordinators may not have updated their module descriptors. I'm sure some of you have inherited courses from other people, and sometimes you may not necessarily update the module coordinator, at least maybe the first year. So it could be that there's like you're using past inherited text that maybe was written by a male. So our recommendations is, I think it will be really interesting to replicate this analysis on a larger sample of module descriptors where we're more likely to have the power to identify statistically significant relationships. So either looking at all module descriptors within a college or across the whole university. I also think that as part of standard practice, it would be a good idea for module coordinators just to run their module descriptor through these gender analytic apps or software. They're freely available online. They're very easy to use, so it's something that's easy to do. But overall, I think we need more research on why students select different modules. In this research, it's somewhat obvious to us that perhaps the module descriptor isn't actually what students use to make decisions, and maybe they rely on other things like their peers, I don't know, the reputation of the lecturer or something like that. But we really don't have much research on that, so that'll be some other interesting work to do. And I'm really sorry that I had to go through this so quickly. It's just my students are waiting for me. So I won't be able to answer any questions, but my email address, my name is Orla Doyle, orla.doyle@ucd.ie. If you have any questions, please just email me. I'm happy to get back to you. And I'm sorry, Francesco, for having to.
No, thank you so much, Orla.
Thank you, Orla.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. And sorry for being, thanks.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I think that this was really interesting for also from the point of view that we were thinking about, that is the approach and how to embed gender in our model descriptor and how to reflect about model descriptors from the point of view of gender. So it's a very interesting project and it's something that maybe other schools can try to develop and to reproduce.